ora, thanks for having me. And thanks for coming too. Just want to say thanks to my family that's also come to listen. So yeah, and just the spark. At 23, I was living in Melbourne, and it was a Sunday night in 2008. If you're anything like me at 23, I hated Sunday nights. I was hungover again, and the weather was bleak outside, and counting down how much sleep I could get before the inevitable 8-kilometre, 45-minute drive to work in mind-numbing Melbourne traffic. I needed a bit of inspiration at that time in my life, and I'd finished school. I had a degree in exercise science, but I was working long hours in a call centre job that I hated, and I wasn't getting paid much. So struggling to accept my fate, I decided to turn the TV on. And I'd lost the TV remote, and I actually had I'd innovated. So my Collingwood Football Club flag became the TV remote. So I used to reach up out of bed and poke the TV on, and it was just the right length. So as the TV came on, I flopped back onto my bed, and I heard that eerie, sorrowful music. Narrating, and it was my auntie Rachel Perkins. And when Rach does something, you should tune in, so I kept watching. It was the first episode, obviously, of First Australians, and as the show unfolded, I learned stories of Bennelong, Pemulwuy, Paddygarang, Governor Arthur Phillip. They were stories of tragedy, heartache and conflict, but also of strength, resilience and inspiration. Stuff I'd never learnt in school. Researchers revealed first-hand accounts of the Australian frontier from archives, journals and research, our history. Growing up typically as a young bloke, sport-obsessed, the heroes I looked up to played footy or cricket. But to be presented with cultural heroes like Pemulwuy or Windradine, that was something new. Every Sunday I'd tune in. The fourth episode was called There Is No Other Law, and it was about Central Australia. I heard an old man speaking in Arrernte, and he said, the Algeta is the only law, there is no other. It was like someone slammed on the handbrake, and it stopped me in my tracks. I used to hear my grandmother talking in Arrernte, or she'd chewing wulpa or pitri. And growing up, I was proud that my family had this other language. I heard about the Ndari or Hermansburg Mission, Blind Moses Jalkabora, the treachery of mounted Constable Wilshire, and the groundbreaking collaboration of Arrernte elders and Spencer and Gillen to stage the Great Ingwara Festival at the Telegraph Station in 1896. I'd always wanted to learn, but how as a kid being raised interstate? But First Australians and hearing Arrernte again, it inspired me. And I couldn't have known where it'd lead. But if it was just to kill the monotony of life and my crappy job, then I'd make an effort to start learning. And that's how I'd fill up my half-empty cup. At work the next day, I wrote on a bit of paper, Arrernte. Growing up, my parents had always brought us to Alice to see Nana and the rest of the family. And on the long drives, I'd stare out the windows and wonder about the bush. I knew I had a skin name, Perrurle, but that was all I knew. I'd struggled as a young guy, the majority of the time being the only Indigenous kid at school or in my sporting teams, and I felt insecure and like I didn't fit in. My family raised us to embrace our heritage, but being interstate, to use a football term, often you were one out, and you didn't have gangers or cousins or uncles or aunties to kind of help you out, you know. So I knew what racial taunts and social isolation felt like. But watching First Australians, I saw our history, and I was inspired by the strength and resilience of our ancestors, and it sparked me into gear. I began buying Arrernte books and researching, and I applied for jobs, and to my shock I actually found a job with the public service, and I left Melbourne. And by 2010 I was working for the voting mob or the Electoral Commission, travelling right throughout the NT, through the top end, Central Australia, WA, South Australia. And I saw a world that was out of sight and out of mind to the rest of the country. Everything was entirely in English, and governments or other service providers seemed to place very little value on our languages. How could we close a health gap, I'd think, while we're relying on plain English to solve complex issues around health and wellbeing and education? We weren't even having a two-way conversation. I remembered reading a quote from T.J.H. Strello who said, "Given time, patience and the ingenuity of future generations, Arrernte and other Indigenous tongues will be able to express adequately all the new ideas that cultural contact is introducing into their environment." Later, I worked at the Central Land Council and I travelled and camped with elders in the bush. I visited sacred sites with them. I saw them in full flight, talking about their homelands and speaking in languages with pride. I would practice my slowly developing language skills, and relatives from bush communities would always encourage and help me. It's hard learning a language in Central Australia, especially when you grow up only speaking English. Outside of the Bible, a dictionary, some books about plants and kinship, you could more easily learn Spanish in Central Australia with all the resources online and audio books and music than you can a local language. At the same time, my cousin brother Joel Liddle had taken great initiative to start a men's health and wellbeing workshop called Codes for Life. We talked about our struggles with grog, our identities, and more importantly, we had a space to share with each other what was happening in our lives. These brilliant, the elder men would come from Utopia and tell us, if you young fellas want a good life, you've got to know both ways right through, Indigenous and Western, English and your language. Get a job, get your kids to school, but most important, maintain our law from the Algera. It was clear it was becoming harder for everyone to learn, but there was so much more pressure to be in town. The internet, phones and social media had tipped the balance way out of whack, and exposure to English had gone up, but what about our languages? I knew we needed more of a digital presence. So one day I posted on Twitter a list of emojis. It went a bit viral, which was shocking because I think my only follower was my older sister. My friend Caddy, who I taught earlier at the Language Centre, emailed me and she asked me if it was possible to do an Indigenous language emoji app, and I was like, hell yeah, let's do it. And I rang my auntie, Mrs. Wallace, and asked her what she thought, and she said, in her one-of-a-kind voice, "Yeah, more young bal, hilanga." Like, yeah, sounds good, young fella, when? She was always excited for cool little projects and things like that. I then asked another inspiring relative, Nana Veronica Perrula Dobson, to join. And together we made emojis relevant to our culture. Also of extinct totemic animals like the Arrernte, the bilby, and the iguana, the bandicoot. Both disappeared from the landscape about 100 years ago because of unchecked feral cats and foxes. We also made a bufflegrass emoji, and we called bufflegrass Namaquan, the bad grass. Bufflegrass it's a threat to tens of thousands of cultural sites within the region. I was proud to work on this project with these two ladies, and we had so much fun, and it was something that I couldn't have imagined that lonely night back in 2008. I delved deeper into the archives and saw how important they were for knowledge revitalisation, health, intergenerational transfer and wellbeing. I could now read and write in Arrernte, so I could work out what early ethnographers and researchers had written in phonetic orthographies. The more language I learnt, the more I saw the world differently. It's like you get an Arrernte set of eyes. Special people came into my life, and they were accepting and nurturing and teaching. More than that, though, I started to feel better about my life. I started to feel like I actually had a purpose. In 2018, Arrernte men on the Strello Research Centre board knew of the hobby research I was doing, and they approached me and asked me to become a researcher with the centre. That year, I also met with distinguished Professor Marcia Langton in Melbourne, and she came up to me and said, "Indigimoji, what are you doing these days?" I was like, I'm just, I work with archives and I'm into health and wellbeing and all this sort of stuff. And she said, right, you better do your PhD then at Melbourne Uni. And you don't know what you're signing up for when you do that. In 2020, I began my doctorate. I wanted to know about young Aboriginal men and their mental health. I'd seen research that had showed that the need was urgent. Many young men flew under the radar, rarely going to doctors, especially those young fellas that aren't confident with English. I knew from my own journey the value of learning and doing things that are intrinsic to you as a human being. I thought this was where I could provide the most value and insight, so I was set out to learn what were the impacts on mental health and well-being when cultural knowledges and languages were lost, fractured, or you didn't have a chance to learn. What are the foundational knowledges that young men need to have better self-esteem and to spend more time on the land, to improve their physical health? I would talk to senior men and women throughout the region and ask them, why were young men struggling? What was happening in their lives, and why were traditional knowledges under pressure? I knew from my research with the archives that senior Aboriginal men who worked with early ethnographers and researchers, they had tremendous intellect. It was on their agency and their encyclopedic knowledge of the Algera that these archives were actually formed. They had an amazing ability to learn and they were multilingual, but we never heard those stories. So I wanted to know and talk to the community members and identify these good things, these positive attributes, so we could identify them for young fellas and they've actually got some goalposts to aim for. In academia, you can't just say it. Obviously, you have to find proof. So my supervisors tasked me with publishing a new hypothesis paper that you can see on the top right there. In the back of my mind, I knew it's great to publish, but I'm talking about language here and it's, we should just publish this in Arrernte then. So I went to Frankie, my cousin Frankie Gorrie at work one day and asked him what he thought, and we got started that day translating that paper into Arrernte. And then we got Nana Veronica Dobson to polish it off in an Australian first to publish an academic paper in an Indigenous language. So, shout out to Frankie and Veronica. Couldn't do it without my two Arrernte supervisors. You've got to have PhD supervisors and they're my Arrernte supervisors. So. I was travelling bush all the time, so having to do my research as well and do interviews with community members, gathering data. If I interviewed an Arrernte or Anmadjada speaker, I did my best to do it in language and then back translate it later to English. I wanted to get people's unfiltered thoughts and views on the world and to really hear what was in their hearts and minds. I learnt that our languages galvanise our communities. They reassociate us with cultural knowledge, with practice and reverence for the land. We have roles and responsibilities to the land and to each other, and we start to appreciate those through our language. Over the years, I'd heard ad nauseum that our languages were never written, but thousands of art sites throughout Central Australia beg to differ. I'd been with old people who had interpreted their meaning, just like texts and pictures in a book telling a story. The Arrernte used interpretive art and design to interpret the Algera and to teach, just like the Egyptians used symbols like hieroglyphics. Saying our languages were never written devalued them and made them seem less. Writing systems and orthographies were developed by elders in collaboration with linguists in the 70s and 80s, and we need to embrace that. Like English had in 1549 with the Book of Common Prayer. Prior to then, English was also not written, not in the way that we know it today. That's only 300 years before McDowell Stewart crossed into Alice Springs and onto the Burt Plain. For our languages to survive, thrive and go with us into the new world, we need a new thinking about old ways. Our stories and our languages is true self-determination. Language is the scaffolding, the structure, the house, and everything that our world is then built off. But if the structure decays or it's abandoned, eventually it will fall. And with your house, like we fill up our houses with our contents and possessions, those are the cultural knowledges, our kinship system and Berniarij, the plants, the animals, the place names and the Algera, each in their rooms. When you learn language, you're more likely to understand and Berniarij. Our social laws, our constitutions, sometimes wrongly kind of translated to kinship. It's much more than kinship. It imbues rules for respectful behaviours, interactions between one another, and special language names we call each other based on our skin name. There's other cultural behaviours and roles in ceremony, but there's other things like food sharing and right skin marriage. When you understand these rules for respect in unburnage, there's less lateral violence. Something we know increases stress on individuals, communities, and leads to increased use of alcohol and other harmful drugs and mental ill health. But some young men today aren't learning their skin name, let alone their language. They need resources. I learned that the loss of cultural knowledge affects everyone, not just the Indigenous community. The fracturing of cultural knowledges, practices and our obligations to the land leads to more transience and urban drift. It leaves people feeling lost and without purpose, and it was a feeling that I knew too. English literacy and numeracy, being educated and having a job are obviously critical, so we need to strike a balance and have a two-way mind. Bilingualism, biliteracy and biculturalism are achievable targets, and we see it all the time in Australia with migrant communities. We can do it too, and people already are. My thesis is on the left there if you would like to read more. If I can get this last page. But most importantly, I guess, like, what did I learn? Not just as some academic, but about myself. I learned that there were a lot of people in the same boat that I was that felt the same way I did, and we all have our own starting point. First Australians wasn't just a spark, it was like fanning an ember to get the flame going. It was something I always felt deep down, but at that time it became something that I could no longer ignore. It gave me life, purpose, direction and passion, and when I started learning, I started to find myself. Thank you.